Hello there, and let's start with part 2 of the story The Great Stone Face. Now by part 2 I mean chapter 10, which is in continuation with chapter 9. So let's start today's session and know what is the end of the story. Before we start with chapter 10, let me just give you a quick summary of what we read in chapter 9 and let's know what the story so far is about. Ernest, who is the main character of the story, lived with his mother in the valley. Now this valley had a natural formation of rocks in such a way that the rocks used to seem like a man's face sideways. And this art of nature was called as the Great Stone Face. Everyone believed in a prophecy that someday the noblest person of his time will come who will resemble this great stone face. And like everyone, Ernest also grew up believing this prophecy and waiting for that person who would make it true. Ernest grew up into a very kind, thoughtful gentleman who helped everyone in the valley and was respected by everyone. In chapter 9, we read that there were two people who arrived. The first one was Mr. Gathergold, who was a rich businessman. Everybody thought that he bears a resemblance and they proclaimed it also. But somehow Ernest did not find it to be true. After that, there was Blood and Thunder, who had left that valley long back, joined army, and from a soldier he rose to become a general. And that was the title which was given to him in the battlefield. So when Blood and Thunder arrived, everyone again was very excited to feel that he also resembles the Great Stone Face. But actually, Ernest did not find it to be true also. That was where chapter 9 ended. Now today we are going to start with chapter 10 and see what is the end of the story. And let's see whether that prophecy comes out to be true or not. Let's start with the session. Many years passed. Ernest was now a man of middle age. To his neighbors, who never suspected means doubted, that he was anything more than an ordinary and familiar face. He was only a humble and hard-working, though thoughtful person. But what about the old prophecy? Was it ever fulfilled? Let us read and find out. The years hurried on and brought white hairs upon the head of Ernest, and made wrinkles across his forehead and furrows in his cheeks. Furrows are deep lines. He was an old man, but not in vain had he grown old. In vain means uselessly. More numerous than the white hairs on his head were the wise thoughts in his mind. And Ernest has ceased to be obscure. Ceased means ended, and obscure means not well known. Unsought for, unsought means not searched for, undesired, had come the fame which so many seek. He had become famous beyond the limits of the valley. College professors and even the active men of cities came from far to see and converse with Ernest. Converse means talk. And he received them with gentle sincerity and spoke freely with them of whatever came uppermost or lay deepest in his heart or their own. While they talked together, his face would brighten. Unawares means unknowing, and shine upon them as with a mild evening light. The years went on, and Ernest grew old. He had wrinkles all over his forehead and his cheeks, and now he was an old man. And more than white hair he had on his head, he had wise thoughts in his mind. Ernest was now a well-known personality, and what many people seek or search for this kind of fame, Ernest got it unsearched. It came to him naturally. He had become famous now beyond the limits of valley, means other people of other cities and villages also knew about him. College professors and other active men of cities came to Ernest to talk with him. And he always received everyone with gentle sincerity and spoke freely whatever came to his heart and his mind. And whenever he talked with them, there was a glow on his face. There was shine of wisdom on his face, just like mild evening light shining upon everyone. While Ernest had been growing old, God had granted a new poet to this earth. He too was a native of the valley, but had spent the greater part of his life in distant cities, pouring out his sweet music everywhere. Neither was the great stone face forgotten, for the poet had celebrated it in a poem. The songs of this poet found their way to Ernest. He read them after his customary toil. Customary toil means usual work. Seated on the bench before his cottage door, as he read, he lifted his eyes to the mountain. Now, as Ernest was growing old, there was a poet who had become quite famous. He also belonged to this valley, but he had left the valley long back and he spent greater part of his life in different cities where he was giving music or writing poems. But this poet never forgot the great stone face and he always talked about this face in all his poems. Recently, Ernest had found this poet's book, and after his everyday work, he used to sit on a bench before his house door and used to read these poems. And whenever he read it, he used to look at this great stone face also. "O great stone face," he said, "is not this man worthy to be your likeness?" The face seemed to smile, but did not answer. Now it happened that the poet, though he lived so far away, had not only heard of Ernest, but had thought much about his character and wished to meet this man whose wisdom walked hand in hand with the noble simplicity of his life. One summer day, therefore, he arrived at Ernest's door, where he found the good old man holding a book in his hand, which he read, and then, with a finger between the leaves, looked lovingly at the great stone face. And while reading and looking at stone face, Ernest asked the stone face if this poet who has written these poems for it, wasn't he worthy to be his likeness? The face did not seem to answer, but it only smiled at Ernest. And recently it so happened that poet had also heard about Ernest, though poet was living far away, but he wanted to meet Ernest, who had wisdom, nobility, and simplicity, all the qualities together in one self. And so one summer day, the poet arrived at Ernest's door, where he found old Ernest holding the book that he had written. He was reading the book and in between lovingly looking at the great stone face. "Good evening," said the poet. "Can you give a traveler a night's shelter?" "Gladly," answered Ernest. And then he added, smiling, "I think I never saw the great stone face look so hospitably at a stranger." Hospitably means gently or kindly. The poet sat down beside him, and he and Ernest talked together. Never before had the poet talked with a man like Ernest, so wise and gentle and kind. Ernest, on the other hand, was moved by the living images. Moved means touched. By the living images flung out of the poet's mind. Flung out means which came out. As Ernest listened to the poet, he imagined that the great stone face was bending forward to listen too. He gazed into the poet's eyes. "Who are you, my gifted guest?" he asked. The poet laid his finger on the book that Ernest had been reading. The poet greeted Ernest by saying good evening and asked him to let him stay there for a night. Ernest agreed gladly as the poet further said with a smile on his face that he had never seen the great stone face welcome a stranger so gently and kindly. The poet sat beside Ernest and they conversed for a while. The poet had never had the chance of talking to a wise, gentle, and a kind man like Ernest. While on the other hand, Ernest was amazed. He was touched by the kind thoughts of this poet. And while Ernest listened to what poet was saying, he visualized that the great stone face was bending and listening to him too. As he looked into the poet's eyes, Ernest very politely asked who he was. And then the poet pointed at the book in Ernest's hand and told him something. "You have read these poems," said he. "You know me, then, for I wrote them." Again and again Ernest examined the poet's features. He turned towards the great stone face, then back. He shook his head and sighed. "Why are you sad?" inquired the poet. "Because," replied Ernest, "all through life I have waited the fulfillment of a prophecy, and when I read these poems, I hoped that it might be fulfilled in you." "You hoped," answered the poet, faintly smiling, "to find in me the likeness of the great stone face? I am not worthy to be its likeness." The poet told Ernest that the book which he was reading was written by him, and then Ernest started to examine poet's features and tried to find some likeness between the great stone face and the poet. But unfortunately, he did not find any likeness. And while seeing him sad, the poet asked, to which the Ernest replied that all through his life he had been waiting for someone who would fulfill that prophecy. And when he read his poems, he hoped that this poet might fulfill this prophecy. But the poet replied that he is not worthy of bearing any resemblance of the great stone face. "And why not?" asked Ernest. He pointed to the book. "Are not these thoughts worthy? You can hear in them the distant voice of a heavenly song. But my life, dear Ernest, has not corresponded with my thoughts." Corresponded means been in harmony with or being alike. "I have had grand dreams, but they have been only dreams. Sometimes I lack faith in my own thoughts. Why then, pure seeker of the good and true, should you hope to find me in the face of the mountain?" The poet spoke sadly, and his eyes were wet with tears. So too were those of Ernest. At the hour of sunset, as had long been his custom, custom means habit, Ernest was to speak to a group of neighbors in the open air. Together he and the poet went to the meeting place arm in arm. From there could be seen the great stone face. Ernest asked the poet why he thinks that he is unworthy, and on hearing this, the poet replied that he might be writing great songs, but his life does not match with his thoughts. He had grand dreams, but they were never materialized, they had only been dreams. And sometimes he lacks faith in his own thoughts. He feels that he doesn't trust his own thoughts. And which is why he asked Ernest why he seemed to find any likeness between the mountain and his face. As the poet spoke this sadly, his eyes were filled with tears, and so were of Ernest. Now it was sunset, and it was a habit that every evening Ernest spoke to a group of neighbors in the open air. So together he and the poet went to that meeting place where he would address his neighbors or public in general, and from where one could see the great stone face also. Ernest threw a look of familiar kindness around upon his audience. He began to speak to the people what was in his heart and mind. His words had power because they agreed with his thoughts, and his thoughts had reality and depth because they harmonized with the life which he had always lived. Harmonized with means corresponded with or agreed with. It was not mere breath that the preacher uttered. Preacher is a person who teaches religion. They were the words of life. A life of good deeds and selfless love was melted into them. The poet, as he listened, felt that the life and character of Ernest were a nobler strain of poetry than he had ever written. Nobler strain of poetry is like a metaphor here, where the poet is comparing Ernest's nobility with a simple poem. His eyes filled with tears, and he said to himself that never was there so worthy a sage as that mild, sweet, thoughtful face with the glory of white hair diffused about it. Diffused means spread all around. Sage means a wise man. When Ernest started to address, he gave a familiar, kind look to his audience. He began to speak whatever was in his heart and his mind. The words that he spoke were powerful because they matched his thoughts. And his thoughts were very deep, they were very close to reality. They always agreed with the life he had always lived. And it was not just that he was teaching, they were the words which he spoke of life, a life which was full of good deeds and selfless love. Ernest also lived this kind of life and he exemplified himself for these good deeds. The poet who was listening to him also felt that the life and character of Ernest was very noble. It was nobler than any true poetry he must have written. And poet's eyes were filled with tears when he said to himself that he had never seen such a wise man, as mild, sweet, who has a thoughtful face, and who has that glory of white hair spread around his face. At a distance, but clearly to be seen, high up in the golden light of the setting sun, appeared the great stone face with white mists around it. Mists means fog, like the white hairs around the brow of Ernest. At that moment, Ernest's face took on an expression so grand that the poet was moved to throw his arms up and shout, "Behold, behold!" Behold means see. Ernest is himself the likeness of the great stone face. Then all the people looked and saw that what the poet said was true. The prophecy was fulfilled, but Ernest, having finished what he had to say, took the poet's arm and walked slowly homeward, still hoping that some wiser and better man than himself would by and by appear, bearing a resemblance to the great stone face. Although a few miles away, the great stone face was clearly visible from their meeting point. The golden light of the sundown fell upon it along with the fog that covered it, just like the white hair around Ernest's eyebrow. At that particular moment, Ernest's grand expression was such that when the poet compared it with the great stone face, he couldn't control himself. He threw his arms up in the air and shouted to draw everyone's attention to the fact that Ernest is the likeness of the great stone face. Everyone could notice it, and they finally established that the poet was telling truth, and finally the prophecy was fulfilled by Ernest. But Ernest was so humble that he finished his speech, and then he held poet's arm, and as they walked slowly towards his home, Ernest still hoped that there will be a man wiser and better than himself, and he would someday come who will be the likeness of the great stone face. So it was the humility of Ernest who did not accept that he himself had fulfilled the prophecy, yet he expected that someone wiser than him will come and do the same. So in this chapter we read that there was a poet and he wrote a book of poems, and in one of his poems he had celebrated or talked about the great stone face. Ernest somehow got that book and he started to read his poem, and whenever he read that poem he had that hope in the heart that whoever has written this poem must be bearing likeness with the great stone face. And on the other hand, the poet also heard much about Ernest. So he came back to this valley to meet the wisest man in the valley, that is Ernest. By then Ernest had grown very old and people had started respecting him a lot. He became famous not only in the valley but also outside the boundaries of valley. So one fine evening when Ernest was reading this book, he saw the poet in front of him. But when Ernest tried to strike a resemblance between the poet's face and the great stone face, he was sad again, he was disappointed again. And poet also told Ernest that he cannot have the resemblance with the stone face because whatever he had written, his thoughts do not match with the life that he was living. Now, in the evening, it was habit. It was a custom that Ernest used to address the people of the valley. So they both went to that meeting place. And as Ernest was speaking, it so happened that the fog or the mist surrounded the great stone face in such a way that it created white eyebrows just like Ernest. The moment the poet saw this, he compared both the faces. He announced, "Look, Ernest resembles the great stone face exactly." And when other people also observed this, they were happy and they were convinced. But here lies the humility of our kind Ernest. Ernest was not overwhelmed by the fame that he had received. He was not proud of the fact that he was the one who had made this prophecy true. Because till the end, Ernest believed that there would come a person who will be nobler than him, wiser than him, and he will resemble the great stone face. So here the story ends, and the story gives you a very beautiful moral which I discussed in chapter 9 also. The same moral lies here too, that it's not necessary that you get everything. You got to wait, you got to be patient. But the moment you get what you desire, you should not leave your humility. And this is where lies the sensitivity or the essence of being a good human being. That's all in this session. In my next session, I will discuss the question answers and the textbook exercises with you. Till then, take good care of yourself, be kind, be grateful, and be joyful. Thank you.